Another related movement during that same time period was the Chicano movement, also known as El Movimiento or Brown Power, similar to kind of Yellow Power and Red Power, kind of branching off from the Black Power movement, and inspired by the Civil Rights movement and other resistance movements at the time. For the Chicano movement, um, centered around issues of discrimination, right? Legacies of discrimination, police brutality, economic inequality, lack of resources, cultural loss, right? The legacy of, especially in the Southwest, um, and school programs, um, and legacies of colonialism, really people in the movement feeling like they were robbed of their right to be proud of their culture, and historical recovery, recovering buried history. And this was the case in all of these movements, right? Trying to kind of decolonize people's sense of self that had been imposed upon them through schooling, through government programs, and trying to recover culture and history. The Chicano movement, like the other movements, was largely based around the youth and especially student and community organizations um, that saw that there was a lack of attention. There was, institutional neglect from um, government organizations providing services to the community. So trying to fill in those gaps through community organizing. In 1969, you had the National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference, at which kind of a plan of action, a plan or a list of kind of organizing principles was put together um, in an attempt to unify these different movements and organizations. Um, and at the same time, you had in 1968 to 1970, you had a Chicano student movement centered in Los Angeles, in East LA, revolving around first you had the Chicano moratorium revolving around um, anti-war activism. So the Vietnam War is going on at the time. We'll talk more about that next week. But Black and Brown communities had disproportionate amounts of people being drafted to serve and be sent to Vietnam to fight. And so there was this call from the community, especially organized by mothers within the community and student organizations, to resist to fight, to speak out against the war, but more specifically against the disproportionate amount of Chicano youth that were being drafted into the military. You also had the East LA walkouts or the East LA blowout, where students were also organizing and saw a connection between, um, young people being drafted into the military or recruited into the military, um, being connected with lack of educational funding and employment opportunities um, in East LA and in Chicano neighborhoods. During these walkouts, you had an LA Times reporter named Ruben Salazar, who was um, one of the few, if not the only, reporter pushing for coverage and fair coverage of the Chicano movement in East LA in the LA Times. Um, he was killed while he was covering those protests. And there's like a lot of controversy and conflict over the story of this, but he was in a bar or a restaurant, I think on Whittier Boulevard, while he was covering the walkouts, and the LAPD shot a tear gas canister into the bar, um, and it hit him and killed him. So um, a lot of people look at him as kind of a martyr of somebody who was targeted for speaking out and for covering this movement. I believe there's a park and other things named after him today in East LA. Related, not directly, but related in terms of um, groups of people that were involved and issues um, developing at the same time was the farm workers movement, also known as La Causa. This revolves around the United Farm Workers Union, which was born out of the unionization efforts of both Filipino farm workers and Mexican farm workers in the Central Valley of California. And actually, a lot of the farm worker organizations started with Filipino farm workers, and um, like through this, you can see that there's connections to imperialism, U.S. imperialism as well. You can look at who made up the majority of farm workers in California. And there were a lot of Filipinos because of the connection between the U.S. Occupation of the Philippines and Filipino immigrants who came to California, some of the only Asian immigrants who were allowed to migrate because they were considered US nationals because the US occupied the Philippines. Um, but coming to the United States and coming to California, they were relegated to um, lower positions in society, didn't have access to jobs and education. Very similar to Mexican migrant farm workers in California as well. And so you have these two groups organizing together eventually, and the Filipino farm workers were led by like Philip Vera Cruz and Larry Itliong. They were like major organizers trying to unionize farm workers because farm workers were not allowed to unionize, um, even though many other industries had unionized or were still struggling with unionization. Um, it just there was such a powerful um, farmers alliance of like the farm owners that would break any attempts to unionize. Um, but eventually we have, along with Philip Vera Cruz and Larry Itliong organizing the Filipino farm workers, you then had Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta organizing the Mexican and Chicano farm workers. And they eventually founded the National Farm Workers Association. Um, and they merged with the Filipino Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, which then became the United Farm Workers, which still exists today. And they're the United Farm Workers because they brought together these two different groups um, into one union. And in 1965, they organized the Delano Grape Strike, which is like the first major strike in any kind of farming industry in the United States, and it was overall eventually successful. And so like they were like picket at I think they first targeted vineyards that were using grapes that were grown by non-union or non-organized farm workers that they felt were exploiting the farm workers, um, and would boycott or called for a boycott by picketing at markets. Cesar Chavez did, a famous march and hunger strike uh, through Central California. Dolores Huerta, like an amazing story of a person who the child of a farm worker and a miner. Um, she eventually became a teacher, and I always like find it amazing. She had 11 children um, in total, and when she, with like I think it was like with 7 children when she was young, began organizing, and she would like cart her children around to all these different organizing meetings. Um, because as a teacher, when she first started teaching, she would in the Central Valley would see kids come to school without shoes and hungry. And she was like, well, like wanted to address the roots of this. This is the roots of economic inequality that were causing the children to live without the things they needed. And so she left teaching and became an organizer instead. Um, so yeah. Um, Related to some of these movements and growing out of some of these movements also was the women's liberation movement that had already drawn upon a tradition in the United States of women's rights organizing, some of which we kind of talked about already. In 1963, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which we read, um, really focusing on the discontent that women were experiencing in terms of having unfulfilled lives and looking at what were the systemic root causes of that. But it primarily focused on white middle class feminism, right? The desire to have a professional career, the desire to be able to, um, gain an education and, um, fulfill like aspirations in terms of career and interests. In 1966, the National Organization of Women was founded with some pretty basic tenets of, what they were organizing around, the idea that women are human beings, um, that they're, you know, uh, humans that deserve chances to live full lives and should not be hampered by their gender, calls for full equality under the law, an active end to prejudice and discrimination in all arenas. And today we kind of take it for granted, but there were a lot of laws that were um, very much intended to um, drive women away from professions and to limit their careers. So, like for example, like women could become teachers, but once women became pregnant, they had to leave the profession. It was against the law for women to teach once they had children. For example, um, openly uh, unequal pay scales, um, just kind of the lack of ability for women to move up in different professions. Um, and so this organization worked to challenge to end constricting gender roles and assumptions about and contempt for women, which is also known as misogyny, right? Like a culturally ingrained disdain for things that are feminine or related to women. And we still, I mean, we still see this today, right? Things that using something as being feminine or like woman like as an insult. Um, so, like trying to address kind of a social structural change, address issues in terms of policy and laws, but also kind of looking at those culturally ingrained undertones of misogyny. Now was nonpartisan. It was not related to any political party. It was committed to protest, open protest, in terms of raising awareness and showing um, uh, resistance to the status quo. In 1969, Gloria Steinem became like the face of the feminist movement. She founded Ms. Magazine um, and wrote an article called After Black Power, Women's Liberation. So very clearly showing that Black Power, like for all the other organizations or all the other movements, power movements I talked about, um, really kind of was the foundation for then looking at, oh, okay, so then what are the other ways? What are the ways that other groups can be also become liberated from oppressive structures? In 1970, Carol Hanich wrote The Personal is Political, an attempt to understand that those things that people felt they just suffered on their own, the personal things, especially women's issues that were considered private, whether it have to do with childbearing or the marriage or the family structure. People consider those private, personal things. Part of women's liberation, according to Hanish, was that these are not personal issues; these are political issues. They are related to the political systems, the social and cultural structures in our society that then condition us to view ourselves and others a certain way. And so part of that liberation was taking away the secrecy and the privacy of women's suffering and bringing it to the forefront to talk about it within the context of society and history. So you had both liberal and radical women's liberation movements. So the word liberal in this context and in a lot of like activist contexts has to do with gaining equality within the existing system. So leaving the system and its structures in place and then working within that system to gain greater equality for various groups. So some examples was the Women's Equity Action League, and now taking actions like filing lawsuits to get equal access to employment, so that you couldn't openly discriminate against women. Women couldn't get loans without a man co-signing. They couldn't get credit cards without a man co-signing. Many government positions were closed to women. Academia and professions were closed to women. A lot of unions were closed to women. And so, kind of those structures, keeping those structures in place, but just wanting women to be able to get access to those. Those are kind of like liberal actions. In 1972, these and other organizations put together the Equal Rights Amendment to try and get that passed by Congress, which would outlaw discrimination based on gender. And it was revived from the 1920s when women first got the right to vote. They had also organized this Equal Rights Amendment to not only get women the right to vote, but to make gender discrimination illegal. It didn't pass in 1923, it didn't pass in 1972, and there is no amendment or right, anything added to the Constitution in terms of outlawing um, gender discrimination in the United States. Then you have radical women's liberation, which was about changing the social and cultural structures and transforming the system, not just leaving it in place and trying to get your seat at the table, but just like throwing out the whole table for a more equitable system. And so you had like women dealing with welfare and mothers' rights,